All right, so now we get to really the heart of what this relates to for your thesis and this issue itself. What are the kinds of, classical and certainly useful today kinds of logical proofs that you create or invent or possibly find, but that are just so common knowledge that you can create and invent them, use them in your appeals to logic, depending on the situation, depending on the argument, right? There are 4 types of these logical proofs, right? Enthymemes, examples, maxims, and signs. Now, some of those are probably fairly familiar. We've certainly talked a great deal about examples in English class over the years. Signs, somewhat familiar in other situations, like certainly driver's ed class, all sorts of signs on the roadway. So a similar sort of thing in appealing to logic here in rhetoric. Maxims, we'll see in just a few moments, maybe in the next video we'll see. Proverbial wisdom and community wisdom. And so most of these logical proofs are fairly familiar. Once we look at these ideas and refamiliarize yourself, you realize, oh yes, I know how to use those. I've been doing it for years and years. Not be a problem. The first one, similarly, enthymemes may sound wholly new, like I've never heard that word before. And even so, it's something that you've probably been doing quite some time. It's just sort of, a classical Greek word that is a kind of structure and argumentation and creating premises and using proofs that you've been doing for some time. So it may seem unfamiliar, but really all 4 types of these logical proofs you've been using and have some experience. So as we practice them and review them here in these next slides, and you practice them yourself, you realize, oh, I know how to do this. This is no problem. So enthymemes are a cousin really to what we've been talking about already a little bit, the syllogism, right? Aristotle loved syllogisms, and he loved dialectic certainly more than rhetoric, and the scientific world certainly driven by the syllogistic sort of form of that syllogism, your major premise, minor premise, 2 main ideas, and your conclusion. Enthymemes are like that. They certainly can use different sorts of premises, but enthymemes are not quite so bound to that limited structure of the syllogism, which is not to say that enthymemes are better because it's not using the same structure, or syllogisms are somehow inferior. They use different sort of forms, and they they exist for different purposes. So we're not saying that one is better now that you're a senior, now you can use enthymemes and finally slough off the limited syllogism. No, syllogism is still a great structure and form for reasoning in different situations, right? And with many things, as we'll see in many of these kinds of appeals to logic, there is still some emotion built in. There's still some ability to think and feel in how we use our rational capabilities, right? We're not, like Mr. Spock from Star Trek, trying to disassociate emotion completely from our logical, rational minds. There are still, even when you're appealing to logic, there are still some human emotional aspects of your audience and things that work together. So even as we look at these appeals to logic, there will still be, the appearance or the sort of remnants of emotion even in them. And the enthymeme itself is part of the human thinking, feeling organism entity together, right? One way that the enthymeme began sort of out of that syllogistic tradition, whereas the major premise of a syllogism, as we said, is a general classification of a class, and the major premise of an enthymeme really can be a wide held community belief. Again, relating back to those commonplaces of which we spoke, last week. The minor premise for an enthymeme could be, or one of your minor premises could be a particular case concerning those beliefs, a specific example. So some of these logical proofs overlap. And so your conclusion would then be just a similar sort of conclusion, whereas you're looking at not just individual particulars and a class of beings or class of those sorts of particulars, you're looking at things that people believe and the ways that people feel about certain issues, and you give specific examples and cases, then you draw your conclusions from them. That is sort of the general kind of arguments of an enthymeme, right? As you said, a few videos ago, this is where you're not necessarily talking about certainties here, you're talking about high degrees of probability, and often in enthymemes you really want to begin your logical arguments, your just basic premise that you use for appealing to logic, a statement that is true or maybe seems so overtly true, as we saw from Aristotle's quotation, or that you're going to prove it with some minor premises or examples of your major premise, or your reasons for accepting the conclusion that you're leading to in your enthymeme. So the major premise and minor premise, there could be several of them. Unlike the syllogism, which just has one major premise, one minor premise in your conclusion, enthymemes can use a variety of premises, whether it's several minor premises to support your major premise, maybe even one without the other. Though, as you can see here from this third bullet point, a major premise without a minor premise might not make as much sense to your audience, unless you are hoping for that and you want to leave some of the premises or the logical arguments implied, and so you let your audience create those gaps themselves, and you lead them to a conclusion, or maybe just give them a conclusion and leave it to your audience to put the work in of creating the reasons for this conclusion. That there are certainly some areas of life that have used that quite a bit. The conclusion sometimes stated first, or like the world of advertising. Sometimes you want to convince your audience by giving them the conclusion, like, because we love going, say for example, like, because we love going on picnics, or because the weather is great, we will go out and have a picnic on Saturday, right? You've stated the conclusion first. Here's the reason why we should do this. That's your conclusion, and then I will give you my reason for accepting that conclusion after I've given you the conclusion, which may seem sort of backward, right? But we realize, I do it all the time. We give our conclusion, here's the good news, and then I'm giving you the reasons why you should accept that good news later, right? And that is an enthymeme, right? You begin with your conclusion. There are different ways of using enthymemes, right? They're very fluid. If you like the form of the syllogism and you don't like the chaos of the enthymeme, you don't necessarily have to use a whole lot of enthymemes, for your thesis. But as you start to think about it, you're like, I've been using these enthymemes, for many years, and I didn't even, just without knowing that this is what they're called, right? Several premises to prove your point, or state your conclusions first, or like in the world of advertisement, maybe just a conclusion, right? Our old friends at Nike, right? Just do it. That is your conclusion. No premises, no explanations, no examples, no reasons why, no clarifications about what it is that's being done. I'm giving you the conclusion here in the world of advertising. I'll let my audience fill in the reasons for them. That is, you may seem like an emotional appeal, just do it. But it is really just an enthymeme, and it's an appeal to logic. Just a conclusion by itself, letting your audience fill in the premises themselves. Very freeing and perhaps, sort of dangerous. But that is part of the exciting world of enthymemes. Right? Another situation in which enthymemes have been used, perhaps more negatively than advertising campaigns, political campaign ads. There's assumed premises, right? Candidate, Smith voted down or did not vote for Proposition 137. Therefore, candidate Smith doesn't like children, doesn't want your children to have an education. So obviously vote for candidate Rogers instead, right? Those assumed premises or even false conclusions, maybe there were other reasons why this incumbent or why this, political candidate did not vote for that, bill in the first place. But the opposing, the opposition is saying, well, here's the conclusion that we have drawn from, obviously they're not stating we have drawn this conclusion from these premises. They are just jumping straight to these conclusions, and whether they're false or not, there's certainly an emotional element, but and it certainly can be immoral, but successful. Obviously, we are wanting you to avoid that sort of appeal with your use of enthymemes. You want your conclusions to be true, and even if you leave assumed premises for your audience, you want them to really think correctly about the world and not necessarily as misleading as sometimes political campaign ads can be, right? So, enthymemes, very useful, whether you use many premises, a major premise, several minor premises, a conclusion, just a conclusion before your other supporting premises. There are lots of different ways to structure enthymemes, right? But they're just, in essence, statements of logical fact, statements of truth that you want your audience to understand and just logically agree. I know I'm using the word logic a lot, but that's basically what enthymemes are, just statements of logical fact. Now, you may structure them with conclusions first, as we said, but there are just many different ways to use enthymemes. So, I want you to feel a little bit more secure in knowing what they are. They're, like syllogisms, not quite the same. You can twist them around, invert the order, conclusions first, just conclusions. There are a lot of ways to structure an enthymeme. Okay? So next video, we will talk about the other three and try to wrap up this exciting world of logical proofs.